I've investigated over 200 alleged hauntings in my career. 23 years of debunking fake ghosts, comforting scared families, and occasionally, very occasionally, finding something I couldn't explain. The Henderson house case took me 6 months to solve. I wish I never had, because what I found was so much worse than any ghost. Let me tell you about the most disturbing investigation of my career. It started with a frantic call from Janet Henderson on a Tuesday morning in October. Her voice was shaken as she described what was happening in their home. The voices start around midnight, she told me. My husband thinks I'm losing my mind, but our dog won't go upstairs anymore. And the smell. There's this chemical smell that comes and goes. I've heard it all before. But when she mentioned that her 18-year-old daughter Sarah had been hospitalized twice for mysterious respiratory problems, I knew I had to take the case seriously. I arrived at the Henderson house that Tuesday evening with my full kit. EMF detectors, thermal imaging cameras, digital audio recorders, and motion sensors. If something supernatural was happening, I'd document it. The house looked normal from the outside. A modest 2-story in a quiet suburban neighborhood. The kind of place where the biggest problem should be whose turn it is to mow the lawn. Janet met me at the door with her husband Mike and daughter Sarah. Mike was skeptical. You could see it in his eyes. Sarah looked pale and kept coughing. Janet looked like she hadn't slept in weeks. I started with baseline EMF readings throughout the house. The master bedroom showed consistent electromagnetic spikes. The house registered temperature fluctuations of nearly 18 degrees. My audio equipment picked up what sounded like whispers in the walls. It's worse at night, Janet whispered as I set up my thermal cameras. That's when the voices get louder, and Sarah, she gets sicker. By 11 p.m. I had documented phenomena that would make any paranormal investigator's career. Clear EVP recordings of voices saying, "Get out." Objects moving on camera with no visible cause, knocking in walls, temperature drops that made your breath visible. But something felt wrong. In 23 years of investigations, I'd learned to trust my instincts. Real paranormal activity is chaotic, unpredictable. This felt systematic. The activity followed patterns. It always started at the same time, always in the same rooms, always with the same progression of events. Real ghosts don't follow schedules. I spent the next week analyzing my evidence. The recordings were clear. The thermal readings were consistent. By every measure I knew, the Henderson house was genuinely haunted. But then Janet mentioned something interesting. "It's strange," she said during my follow-up call. "The activity stops when Mrs. Barber goes to visit her sister on weekends. We actually get some peace then." Mrs. Barber was their next-door neighbor, 78 years old, lived alone since her husband died 3 years ago. Janet described her as the sweetest old lady you'd ever meet. That's when I started paying attention to the house's layout. The Henderson basement shared a wall with Mrs. Barber's property. The ductwork ran along that shared wall, and Mrs. Barber had keys to their house. She watered their plants when they went out of town. I came back the following Tuesday with more sensitive equipment. The EMF readings were strongest along the basement wall. The temperature fluctuations originated from the same area, and when I put my ear to the wall, I could hear something that made my blood freeze. Footsteps on the other side of the wall, at 2 a.m. when Mrs. Barber should have been asleep in her own house. That's when I found it, hidden behind an old water heater. There was an opening in the foundation wall, a slit in the wall like a hidden door, big enough for a determined person to walk and slide through. I set up my hidden camera focused on that wall opening. What I captured 3 nights later destroyed my faith in humanity forever. Mrs. Barber, this sweet 78-year-old grandmother, sneaking through that opening at 1:30 a.m. with a bag of electronic devices and chemical containers. I watched her place small electromagnetic pulse devices near the electrical outlets, explaining the EMF readings. She installed tiny speakers in the ductwork for the ghost voices. motion-activated mechanisms that could move lightweight objects and create knocking sounds in the walls. But the worst part was watching her pour industrial cleaning chemicals into their ventilation system. Chemicals that would cause respiratory distress, headaches, nausea, chemicals that were slowly poisoning the entire family. When I investigated further, I discovered Mrs. Barber had been trying to buy the Henderson property for 4 years. She wanted to expand her lot and build rental units. When the Hendersons refused to sell, she decided to make their house unlivable. For 8 months, she had been systematically poisoning them all, while making them believe their house was haunted. Sarah's respiratory problems weren't mysterious. They were caused by deliberate chemical exposure. Janet's insomnia and paranoia weren't psychological. They were symptoms of chronic low-level poisoning. The ghost voices were Mrs. Barber speaking through the speakers she'd hidden in their vents. The moving objects and knocking sounds were triggered by motion sensors she controlled from her own basement. She had turned their home into a house of horrors, and she was the monster hiding next door. I called the police immediately. When they searched Mrs. Barber's basement, they found a control panel that looked like something from a spy movie. Monitors showing camera feeds from inside the Henderson house, remote controls for all her supernatural effects, and enough industrial chemicals to kill a dozen families. Miss Barber's defense team painted her as a confused elderly woman with dementia. The judge gave her 2 years of house arrest and community service. 2 years for 8 months of attempted murder disguised as a haunting. The Henderson family moved out 3 weeks later. The psychological damage was done. Sarah still had respiratory problems. Janet suffers from severe anxiety and trust issues. Mike blames himself for not believing his wife sooner. As for me, I've investigated 47 cases since then. Each time, I find myself looking for the human monster hiding in the supernatural explanation. Because I learned something that changed everything I thought I knew about my profession. The most terrifying hauntings aren't caused by the dead trying to communicate with the living. They're caused by the living trying to destroy each other, using our belief in the supernatural as the perfect cover. Mrs. Barber sold her house 6 months after her conviction and moved to Arizona. I sometimes wonder if her new neighbors have started experiencing any unexplained phenomena. Because now I know the truth. The real monsters aren't hiding in the shadows of the spirit world. They're hiding behind sweet smiles in the house next door.